Matthew had barely pushed the divorce papers across the table when Claire stopped cutting her birthday cake. She looked at the papers, then at him. "Is this why you've been acting strange?" Matthew's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He didn't answer. Claire quietly set the knife down and reached beneath the table for her purse. For a second, Matthew looked almost relieved, as if he expected her to cry, argue, or beg him to reconsider. Instead, she pulled out a sealed envelope and placed it beside the divorce papers. Matthew stared at it. "What's that?" Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Something I wasn't sure you'd ever have the courage to ask me about." He opened it. The color slowly left his face, and Claire still hadn't told him the one thing she had discovered 3 weeks earlier. "Welcome to Greer Stories, my amazing family. Tonight we're stepping into a marriage where the hardest part isn't losing the person you love. It's realizing they may have been carrying a truth you never gave them the chance to share. Stay with me, because what happened on Claire's birthday changed the way both of them understood their marriage." The first time Claire Bennett challenged Matthew Hale, she wasn't trying to impress him. She was trying to stop him from approving a plan she believed would make life harder for people who already had enough to deal with. Matthew stood at the front of a Raleigh community development meeting, one hand resting against the edge of the presentation table as he explained the redevelopment proposal. The project would improve drainage, widen several roads, add commercial space, and replace a stretch of aging infrastructure that had been causing problems for years. His numbers were organized. His maps were detailed. His explanation was clear. Then Claire raised her hand. Matthew noticed her because she'd been taking notes without looking up much. "Yes?" She glanced at the screen behind him. "You've accounted for construction costs, traffic flow, drainage, and commercial access." Matthew nodded. "Right. What about the residents?" The room went quiet enough for him to hear someone close a notebook. Matthew looked back at the map. "The plan includes relocation assistance." "That wasn't really what I asked." His expression tightened. Claire didn't seem to notice, or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. "You've drawn the new roads," she continued, "but there are families living in those houses. Some have been there 20 or 30 years. Where exactly are they supposed to go while all this happens?" Matthew leaned slightly toward the microphone. "We can't design infrastructure around every individual household circumstance." "No, but you can design it without pretending those circumstances don't exist." A few people looked between them. Matthew had spent the last several months working on the proposal. He knew exactly how many limitations had already been placed on the project. "The engineering requirements aren't optional," he said. "I know. Then you understand there are things we can't simply change because they're inconvenient." Claire finally looked directly at him. "I didn't say inconvenient." She paused. "I said human." Matthew stared at her. For a second, neither spoke. Then someone near the back of the room cleared his throat, and the meeting moved on. Claire said nothing else. Matthew finished his presentation. When it was over, people gathered around him with questions, but his attention kept drifting toward the woman who had packed her notebook and was already heading for the door. He caught up with her in the hallway. "Claire Bennett?" She turned. "Yes?" "I didn't like your question." She gave him a small, unsurprised smile. "I noticed." Matthew almost laughed. "I mean it." "So do I." He shifted the folder under his arm. "You weren't wrong." That seemed to catch her off guard. "Okay." "I still think parts of your argument were unrealistic." "There it is." "What?" "The part where you compliment me and then take it back." "I didn't take it back." "You're working on it." He smiled despite himself. Claire adjusted the strap of her bag. "You're Matthew, right?" "Matthew Hale. Civil engineer." "That's what the badge says." She glanced at his name tag. "You're funny." "I wasn't trying to be." "That usually means it's genuine." She started walking. Matthew followed for a few steps. "Can I ask you something?" Claire looked over. "Are you going to disagree with me again?" "Probably." That made her laugh. He stopped beside the building's front doors. "I'd like to hear more about the residents you were talking about." She studied him carefully. "Why?" "Because I think I missed something." Claire wasn't expecting that answer. Neither was Matthew. He had been expecting to defend himself. Instead, He found himself wanting to understand why she'd been so certain. "Dinner?" he asked. She looked at him. "Are you asking me out?" "I don't know yet." "That sounds promising." "I was thinking dinner and a conversation." "That's still a date." "Then I suppose it is." Claire smiled. "Fine." Matthew picked the restaurant. That turned out to be his first mistake. The place was expensive, crowded, and somehow managed to make a simple chicken dish taste complicated. Claire took 2 bites, put down her fork, and looked across the table. "This is bad." Matthew nearly choked on his drink. "You could have waited until dessert." "I don't think dessert can save this." "You chose to come. You chose the restaurant." "Fair." She leaned closer. "Do you actually like this place?" Matthew looked around. "No." She stared at him. "Then why'd you bring me here?" "I thought it looked impressive." Claire laughed. "That's your problem." "What is?" "You care too much about what things look like." Matthew smiled. "You've known me for 3 hours. And I'm already right." He shook his head. "Where would you go?" "Somewhere I actually like." 20 minutes later, they were sitting in a small neighborhood restaurant, with scratched wooden tables, crowded booths, and a menu that had clearly been around longer than either of them. Matthew looked around. "This is your place?" "Don't sound so surprised." He took a bite, then another. "This is really good." "I know." He looked at her. "You enjoy being right." "Only when I'm right." That became the beginning. Not fireworks, not some perfect first date. Just 2 people who discovered they could disagree without needing the other person to lose. Over the next few weeks, dinner turned into phone calls. Phone calls turned into weekends. And somewhere along the way, Matthew realized Claire wasn't interested in making him feel impressive. She was interested in knowing whether he was honest. She asked difficult questions. She told him when she thought he was wrong. She laughed when he took himself too seriously. And when Matthew told her something she didn't want to hear, she didn't punish him for saying it. That mattered to him more than he understood at the time. Because long before Claire became his wife, she became the person Matthew trusted to tell him the truth. Neither of them knew yet how much their entire marriage would depend on that. Claire and Matthew didn't have one particular day when they became a couple. It happened gradually. A dinner became another dinner. Then Matthew started keeping her favorite coffee in his kitchen. Claire began leaving a sweater at his apartment because she was tired of carrying it back and forth. Neither mentioned it. They both knew. Their relationship grew around conversation. They argued about money, work, family, restaurants, and even which side of the bed had better air conditioning. Claire usually won that one because she was more stubborn. Matthew claimed otherwise. "You're confusing stubbornness with confidence," she told him once. "That's exactly what stubborn people say." She laughed. They were comfortable enough to disagree, without turning every disagreement into a test. That mattered. One evening, Claire was sitting on Matthew's couch when he came home later than usual. He dropped his keys into the bowl by the door and stood there without taking off his jacket. Claire looked up from her book. "You okay?" "Yeah." She watched him. "You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "Standing in the doorway like you forgot where you live." He smiled faintly. "Long day." She closed the book. "Bad?" Matthew nodded. He sat down beside her, but didn't say anything. Claire didn't push. A few minutes passed. Finally, Matthew said, "I messed something up." She turned toward him. "At work?" "Yeah." "What happened?" He rubbed his hands together. "I missed something on a project review. It wasn't catastrophic, but it should have been caught earlier." Claire waited. "I've already fixed it." "Then why do you look like somebody died?" He gave a short laugh. "I don't know." She studied him. "You hate making mistakes." "I hate making mistakes that other people have to clean up." Claire leaned back. "Everybody makes mistakes." "Not like this." She didn't tell him he was being dramatic. She didn't tell him it wasn't a big deal. She simply said, "Okay." Matthew looked at her. "Okay? That's it? What do you want me to say?" He thought about it. Nothing. So she didn't. She stayed beside him. After a while, Matthew leaned back and closed his eyes. You're not disappointed? Claire looked at him. I would be disappointed if you lied to me about it. His eyes opened. She shrugged. Making a mistake isn't the same thing as being a bad person. Matthew didn't answer, but something in his face loosened. That was one of the first times he understood that Claire wasn't expecting him to be impressive all the time. She wanted him to be honest. That was different. Years later, that distinction would matter. For now, they kept building a life. When they married, it wasn't because they believed they would never hurt each other. They knew better. They married because they had already seen each other on bad days and stayed. Their wedding was small. The people they loved were there. Claire remembered laughing more than she remembered being nervous. Matthew remembered looking at her and thinking that somehow the woman who had challenged him in a community meeting had become the person standing beside him at the altar. Afterward came ordinary life, a house in Raleigh, 2 checking accounts that eventually became 1, a mortgage, grocery lists stuck to the refrigerator, arguments over whose turn it was to replace the empty paper towel roll. Claire sometimes worked late. Matthew sometimes forgot to call when he was running behind. Neither was particularly good at apologizing immediately, but they usually came back to the conversation. One year, money became tighter than usual. They sat at the kitchen table with statements spread between them. Matthew stared at the numbers. We need to cut back. Claire nodded. I know. Maybe the vacation. She sighed. Neither liked it. They canceled the trip. That night, Claire found Matthew looking at the canceled reservation on his phone. You really wanted to go. He shrugged. So did you. I did. He put the phone down. We'll go later. Claire smiled. Promise? Promise. They didn't know it then, but those ordinary decisions were part of what made the marriage strong. They made them together. When Claire's mother needed unexpected financial help, Matthew didn't ask whether the problem technically belonged to him. He simply opened the banking app. How much? Claire stared at him. You don't have to. I know. She swallowed. Thank you. He nodded. Don't make it weird. She laughed through the tears gathering in her eyes. I'm not crying. I didn't say you were. You were thinking it. I was thinking you're very dramatic. She threw a napkin at him. He caught it. Those were the moments Claire remembered. Not expensive gifts. Not anniversaries. The small moments when Matthew made it clear that her problems didn't become less important because they weren't his. And Matthew had his own memories, like the night he came home after a brutal week and found Claire sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. She pushed one toward him. You don't have to talk. He looked at her. What if I want to? Then I'll listen. So he talked. For nearly an hour, he told her what had gone wrong at work, what embarrassed him, what made him angry, and what he was afraid might happen next. Claire didn't interrupt. She didn't offer a solution. When he finally stopped, she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Feel better? A little. Good. Matthew looked at their joined hands. I don't know what I'd do without you. Claire smiled. You'd probably eat cereal for dinner more often. That too. They laughed. It was a small moment. Neither of them knew they were practicing the very thing their marriage would eventually lose, trusting the other person with something uncomfortable before it became unbearable. For years, they believed that was simply who they were. If something went wrong, they told each other. If money was tight, they talked. If one of them was scared, the other knew. If one of them made a mistake, the other stayed. They didn't realize that trust isn't something a marriage earns once and keeps forever. It has to be chosen again when the truth is hardest to tell. And Matthew was eventually going to face a truth he was terrified to bring home. This time, he wouldn't sit across from Claire and tell her. He would try to handle it himself. Claire had a habit of saying, I'm fine, when she wasn't. Matthew knew it. He also knew better than to ask the same question 5 times. One Thursday evening, Claire came home, dropped her bag near the stairs, and went straight to the kitchen. Matthew was at the stove. You're home early. Mm-hmm. He looked over. How'd the meeting go? Fine. Matthew waited. Claire opened the refrigerator and stared inside without taking anything out. Claire. What? You've been standing there for 30 seconds. She closed the door. I know. What happened? Nothing. He looked at her. That sounded different from fine. Claire reached for a glass. I don't want to talk about it. Matthew nodded. Okay. He turned back to the stove. Claire stood there for another moment. You're not going to ask again? No. She looked almost disappointed. I thought you were supposed to know when I'm lying. I know you're lying. Then why aren't you asking? Because you said you don't want to talk. She sighed. Fine. She filled the glass with water. The organization lost one of the housing grants. Matthew turned around. How much? Enough. Claire, I said I'd handle it. You don't have to handle everything. I know. You always say that. And you always say you want me to tell you things. I do. Then let me tell you when I'm ready. Matthew watched her. Okay. That was it. No slammed doors. No raised voices. Just a conversation that ended before either of them had said what they actually meant. Later that night, Claire found Matthew reading in bed. She stood beside him. I shouldn't have snapped at you. He lowered the book. You were stressed. Still. She sat beside him. For a while, she said nothing. Then she looked down at her hands. I am worried. Matthew closed the book. I know. I hate that. What? Needing help. He leaned back against the headboard. You don't have to do everything alone. Claire gave him a tired smile. You're very good at saying that. Because you don't listen. Neither do you. Matthew smiled. Fair. She leaned against his shoulder. I just don't want to become somebody you have to take care of. His expression changed. You're my wife. I know. So? Claire looked at him. So sometimes I don't know how to be that person. Matthew didn't have an answer. He simply put his arm around her. That was enough, at least that night. Matthew had his own version of the same problem. He could admit a project needed more work. He could tell a client a deadline had moved. He could sit through a meeting where someone criticized his calculations without taking it personally. What he struggled with was disappointing someone who believed in him, especially Claire. Once, after a project had gone badly, he sat in his car outside their house for nearly 20 minutes before going inside. Claire eventually knocked on the window. He looked up. You planning to come in? In a minute. She opened the passenger door and sat down. Bad day? Yeah. What happened? Matthew stared through the windshield. Work. Claire waited. He didn't say anything else. You don't have to tell me. I know, but you usually do. Matthew rubbed his hands together. I don't want you thinking I can't handle things. Claire turned toward him. I've never thought that. Not yet. Her expression tightened. What does that mean? Nothing. Matthew, he exhaled. I just hate messing things up. Claire reached across the console and took his hand. Then don't hide it when you do. He looked at her. You'd rather know? I'd rather know the truth. He nodded. For a moment, he looked relieved. Then Claire squeezed his hand. You don't have to be impressive with me. Matthew laughed quietly. That's unfortunate. Why? I've been working very hard on it. She smiled. Clearly. They stayed in the car a little longer. Neither of them said much after that. They didn't need to. But there was something neither had fully recognized about themselves. Claire wanted to be strong enough that Matthew would never have to worry about her. Matthew wanted to be successful enough that Claire would never have to worry about him. They were trying to protect each other. They just didn't realize that protection could become another name for hiding. Claire sometimes kept quiet because she didn't want to be a burden. Matthew sometimes kept quiet because he didn't want to be a disappointment. For years, their marriage handled those weaknesses well enough. When Claire needed help, she eventually asked. When Matthew made a mistake, he eventually came home and told her. Not always immediately, not always gracefully, but he told her. And Claire stayed. That was their pattern, until fear made honesty feel dangerous. Matthew would eventually face something he wasn't sure he could fix. He would look at the consequences and think about Claire. He would imagine the questions she might ask, the disappointment she might feel, the plans they might have to change, and before he ever heard her say a word, he would decide what her reaction would be. He wouldn't mean to betray her. He would tell himself he was protecting her. He would tell himself he only needed a little time. He would tell himself that once he fixed everything, he would explain. For a while, that lie would probably even feel reasonable. Because the hardest lies aren't always the ones people tell other people. Sometimes they're the ones they tell themselves before they ever open their mouths. And Matthew had not yet learned how dangerous that could be. Matthew knew something was wrong before anyone said his name. He was standing at the end of a conference table while 3 contractors argued over which set of drawings they had been working from. That revision was sent last Tuesday. No, it wasn't. It was. I have the email. Matthew looked at the plans spread across the table. Then he noticed the date in the corner. His stomach dropped. The drainage section they were discussing wasn't based on the latest information. It was an older set of drawings. Stop! The room went quiet. Matthew pulled the page toward him. Where did this come from? One of the contractors pointed across the table. That's what we received. Matthew looked at the document again. He knew that file. He remembered reviewing it. He remembered approving part of the work. What he couldn't remember was asking the question he should have asked. Had the underlying site information changed? It had. And nobody had caught the discrepancy before construction moved forward. Not the contractor, not the reviewing team, and not Matthew. The meeting broke apart into phone calls and hurried conversations. Someone called the project manager. Someone else contacted the contractor. Matthew stayed at the table. He kept looking at the drawing. There were several places where someone could have noticed the problem. That should have made him feel better. It didn't, because one of those places had been his desk. By the end of the afternoon, corrective work was already being discussed. The mistake wasn't catastrophic. Nobody was talking about prison. Nobody was saying the entire project was ruined. But fixing it would cost money. More importantly, it would raise questions about how the mistake had happened and who had approved what. Matthew sat in his office after everyone left. His phone buzzed. Claire, you coming home for dinner? He stared at the message. He started typing. Yeah, just a long day. He stopped. Deleted it. Typed again. Running late. Don't wait for me. He sent that instead. Then he looked back at the drawings. The company would absorb part of the cost. Insurance would likely cover another portion. The contractor had responsibility too. His manager had already said that. But there was still financial exposure. And there was something worse than the money. Matthew had spent years building his reputation around being careful, being dependable, being the person people trusted when a project became complicated. Now his name was attached to a decision that shouldn't have passed review. He opened the preliminary cost estimate. The number at the bottom wasn't final. It could change. Maybe it would be lower. Maybe the company would handle more of it. Maybe the whole thing would settle without becoming the disaster his mind was already turning it into. He closed the document, then opened it again. He calculated what the possible exposure could mean for him personally. The number made him sit back. Their mortgage, their savings, Claire's work, the plans they'd made. None of it was necessarily in danger. But Matthew couldn't stop thinking about the possibility. That was the problem. He wasn't looking at what was likely. He was looking at everything that could go wrong. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was Claire. Everything okay? Matthew stared at the words. He could call her. He could tell her. He could say, I made a mistake at work. I don't know how bad it is yet. And I'm scared. She would probably come sit beside him. She'd ask questions. She'd tell him they'd figure it out. She had done exactly that before. Matthew knew all of this. His thumb hovered over the screen. Then he locked the phone. Not tonight. He just needed to understand the situation first. That was all. He would tell her once he had facts. Once he knew the number. Once he knew what the company was going to do. Once he had something useful to say. By the time he left the office, Matthew had convinced himself that waiting wasn't hiding anything. It was being responsible. He stopped at a red light on the drive home and noticed his wedding ring against the steering wheel. Claire had once told him that she didn't need him to solve every problem before bringing it home. She just needed to know when there was a problem. Matthew remembered that. He also remembered how afraid he'd been when he'd said it mattered to him. The light turned green. He drove on. When he walked through the front door that evening, Claire looked up from the kitchen. "You're late." "Yeah." She studied his face. "Bad day?" Matthew set his keys down. "Long day." Claire waited. He took off his jacket. "I'm going to shower." She watched him disappear down the hallway. For the first time in years, Matthew had come home carrying something he had decided Claire didn't need to know. And because the decision felt temporary, he didn't yet understand what he had started. Matthew told himself he wasn't hiding anything. Not really. He was waiting. The next morning, he called the project manager before Claire woke up. By the time she came downstairs, he had already learned that the company would cover part of the corrective work. That should have made him feel better. It didn't. "There you are," Claire said, reaching for the coffee. Matthew closed his laptop. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." He looked at her. "Everything okay?" Claire gave him a look. "That's my question." He smiled. "I'm fine." She waited. He picked up his coffee. "Work's just complicated right now." "What kind of complicated?" "Nothing I can't handle." Claire watched him for a second. Then she nodded. "Okay." Matthew hated how easy that answer had been. Over the next few days, he began making calls he didn't tell her about. His first conversation with a financial advisor lasted 20 minutes. He didn't ask for anything dramatic. He simply wanted to understand what would happen if the project became more expensive than expected. The advisor asked for numbers. Matthew provided them. When the call ended, he sat in his car for several minutes before starting the engine. The advice wasn't catastrophic. That almost made it worse. There were ways to protect their savings. There were ways to restructure certain obligations. There were options. But every option required him to admit there was a problem. He wasn't ready for that. A week later, he canceled the trip Claire had been looking forward to. They had been planning it for months. Claire came home with her phone in her hand. The hotel sent an email. Matthew looked up. "What about it?" "They said the reservation was canceled." He hesitated. "I canceled it." Claire stared at him. "Why?" "Things are tight right now." She lowered the phone. "Since when?" Matthew looked back at his laptop. "Work's been unpredictable." "That doesn't answer the question." "I just thought it made sense." Claire was quiet. "You could have talked to me." "I know." "Then why didn't you?" Matthew closed the laptop. "Because it was one trip, Claire." She looked at him. "I know." She walked away. Matthew stayed at the table. He wanted to call her back. Instead, he told himself she'd understand later. That became the phrase he used whenever something felt uncomfortable. Later, he'd explain the project. Later, he'd explain the money. Later, he'd explain why he had become so distracted. Later, he'd fix everything. The trouble was that later kept requiring something new. A few days after the canceled trip, Matthew moved money from one account into another. It wasn't a large transfer. He intended to replace it. He told himself it was temporary. Then another bill came due. Another conversation happened with the company. Another estimate arrived. The number was higher. Matthew stared at it. He moved more money. This time, he deleted the notification from his phone. That evening, Claire noticed. "Did you get a bank alert?" Matthew looked up from the television. "No." She studied him. "I thought I heard your phone." "Probably something from work." She nodded. Nothing more. But later, while brushing her teeth, Claire found herself thinking about the answer. Not because she believed Matthew was lying, because he had never used to make her feel like she needed to wonder. The next week, Matthew spoke privately with another advisor. Then he called an attorney. The attorney asked questions Matthew wasn't prepared to hear. What assets were jointly held? What debts were in his name? What obligations could affect his spouse? Matthew stopped him. "I'm not filing anything." "I understand. I'm just trying to understand my options." "That's what we're doing." Matthew nodded. He left the office with a folder he didn't want Claire to see. He placed it in his briefcase beneath his work documents. That evening, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table sorting mail. Matthew walked in. She glanced at the briefcase. "What's in there?" "Project paperwork." "More problems?" "Nothing new." She nodded. Matthew went upstairs. Claire watched him disappear. She picked up the envelope he'd left on the counter. It wasn't addressed to him. She turned it over. A financial advisory firm's name was printed across the front. She didn't open it. She simply set it back down. When Matthew returned downstairs, she was still at the table. "You've been busy." "Yeah." "With work?" He paused. "Mostly." Claire nodded slowly. "Mostly?" Matthew looked at her. She smiled faintly. "Forget it." He didn't ask what she meant. That night, Claire woke and found his side of the bed empty. She walked downstairs. Matthew was sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a spreadsheet. He quickly closed the laptop. "You okay?" "Yeah." "What are you working on?" "Just something I need to finish." Claire stood there. She could have asked again. Instead, she nodded. "Okay." She went back upstairs. Matthew remained at the table. The next morning, Claire noticed his briefcase was no longer beside their bedroom door. It was in his office. The drawer was locked. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked away. Matthew still believed he was protecting their marriage. Claire was beginning to feel protected from him. The call came a little after 10 on a Tuesday night. Matthew's phone vibrated on the nightstand. He reached for it before the second ring. Claire opened her eyes. "Who is that?" "Work." He was already getting out of bed. "Do you have to answer?" "I'll be right back." He pulled on his jeans and left the room. A moment later, Claire heard the back door open. She stared at the ceiling. Matthew had taken work calls at home before, but lately he had started taking them outside. When he finally came back, she was still awake. "Everything okay?" "Yeah." "What did they want?" "Just a project issue." "Another one?" Matthew paused. "It's handled." Claire looked at him. "Okay." He changed and got back into bed. A few minutes passed. "Matthew?" "Yeah?" "Are you sure you're okay?" He stared at the ceiling. "I'm fine." Claire turned onto her side. She didn't ask again. But she didn't sleep either. Over the next few days, the little things continued. Matthew kept his phone face down. He spent more time in his office. Sometimes Claire walked into a room, and he would close his laptop before she reached him. Once, she asked what he was working on. "Project stuff." She nodded. She was beginning to hate that phrase. Still, she didn't suspect an affair. Not at first. Matthew wasn't secretive by nature. That was what made the changes so unsettling. Then one Saturday, Claire came home early. Matthew wasn't there. She left her purse by the stairs and went looking for a folder she'd asked him about earlier in the week. His office door was open. A stack of papers sat near the edge of his desk. She wasn't looking for anything private. Then, she saw the words printed across the top of one page. "Apartment lease options." Claire stopped. She picked up the paper. There were several listings, different locations, different prices. She read the first page again, then the second. Her stomach tightened. She heard the garage door open. Matthew walked inside and stopped when he saw her. "You're home?" "Yeah." His eyes went to the paper in her hand. Claire noticed. "What is this?" "Claire, are you looking for an apartment?" Matthew hesitated. "It's not what you think." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "That sentence never helps. It's related to work." "Then why does it look like you're moving?" "I'm not moving." "Then who's moving?" Matthew looked away. That pause was enough to change something in her face. "Is there someone else?" His head came up. "What? You heard me." "No." The answer came quickly. Claire searched his face. "No?" "No. There's nobody else." She nodded once. "Okay." "Claire, I mean it." "I heard you." "Then why are you looking at me like that?" "Because I don't understand anything anymore." Matthew stepped closer. "I can't explain this yet." She looked at him. "You can't?" "Not yet." "Why?" He rubbed his forehead. "Because I don't have everything figured out." Claire's voice dropped. "You've been figuring things out without me." Matthew didn't answer. She put the papers back on the desk. "I don't want to fight." "Neither do I." "Then don't make me feel like I'm crazy for noticing." He looked at her. "I never said that." You don't have to. Claire walked past him. At the bedroom doorway she stopped. If there is something going on, I'd rather hear it from you. Matthew stood behind her. There isn't another woman. Claire closed her eyes for a second. Okay. She wanted to believe him. So she did. Or tried to. For the next several days, she stopped looking for an explanation. Instead, she watched. Not deliberately. At least, that's what she told herself. She noticed when Matthew came home late. She noticed when he took calls in the garage. She noticed that his briefcase never seemed to leave his side anymore. Then, one evening, she was sorting through the mail while Matthew was upstairs. An envelope slipped from beneath a stack of papers. She picked it up. It was from a financial services firm. She turned it over. There was another sheet underneath. Claire read the heading, Marital Assets. She stopped breathing for a moment. The house, their savings, retirement accounts, insurance information, everything was listed. She read it twice. Then she put it back exactly where she'd found it. When Matthew came downstairs, she was sitting at the kitchen table. He looked at her. You okay? Claire nodded. Yeah. He reached for his keys. She watched him. Matthew? He turned. Yeah? Why would you need a list of our assets for work? He didn't answer immediately. That was the problem. I can explain. Claire waited. When? He looked down. I don't know. She nodded. Okay. She didn't press him. Not because she wasn't worried. Because she suddenly wasn't sure what questions she was supposed to ask. That night, Claire lay beside him in the dark. Matthew was turned away from her. She stared at his back. The thought she'd been avoiding returned. Maybe there wasn't another woman. Maybe the apartment wasn't for someone else. Maybe the truth was worse. Maybe Matthew was preparing to leave. Claire closed her eyes. She thought about their first apartment together, their house, the wedding, the kitchen table, where they'd made decisions about money. All those years when Matthew had told her that if something was wrong, she would know. Now she was lying beside him, trying to figure out whether her husband was making plans for a life she wasn't part of. Across the room, his phone lit up. Matthew reached for it before she could see the screen. Claire said nothing. The next morning, he kissed her cheek before leaving. Love you. She managed to smile. Love you too. The door closed. Claire stood into the quiet hallway. She still loved her husband. That part was easy. What she no longer knew was whether he was still making decisions with her. And for the first time, she was afraid the answer might be no. Matthew stopped sleeping well. The project was no longer getting worse. The company had accepted responsibility for part of the corrective work. The contractor was involved. Insurance was being reviewed. His manager had even told him that the mistake, while serious, was manageable. Matthew heard all of that. He just couldn't make himself believe it. After Claire went to bed, he sat in his office with the same documents spread across his desk. The mortgage, their savings, retirement accounts, insurance. He ran the numbers again. If the situation became expensive, they could sell the house. They could use some savings. He could move somewhere smaller. He could work longer hours. He could rebuild. Claire would have to make changes, but she wouldn't be tied to the consequences of something she hadn't done. That thought stayed with him. He opened a spreadsheet and began separating what belonged to him from what belonged to Claire. After several minutes, he stopped. He stared at the screen. What am I doing? There was nobody there to answer. He closed the laptop, then opened it again. The idea had already taken root. If they divorced, maybe he could contain the damage. He could take responsibility for his mistake. Claire could keep what she had built. She could make decisions about her future without waiting for his career to recover. The more he thought about it, the more reasonable it sounded. Not easier, just cleaner. He spoke to the attorney again. This time, he asked questions he hadn't asked before. What would happen to the house? What would happen to their accounts? How would debts be handled? What would the process look like? The attorney listened, then asked, Have you talked to your wife? Matthew looked down at the legal pad. No. You should. I know. He said it quietly, but he still didn't do it. That evening, Claire was in the kitchen making dinner when Matthew came home. She glanced over. You're quiet. Just tired. You want a plate? In a minute. Matthew stood near the doorway and watched her stir the sauce. She looked completely ordinary, comfortable, familiar. She had no idea what he'd been doing that afternoon. Claire tasted the sauce. Too much salt. Matthew smiled. You always say that. Because you always disagree. I didn't say anything. You were thinking it. He laughed. For a moment, the thought of divorce felt impossible. This was his wife, the woman who knew how he took his coffee, the woman who had sat beside him when work went badly, the woman who had never demanded that he be perfect. He almost told her. He could have done it right there. Claire, I made a mistake. There's a financial problem. I've been talking to people because I'm scared. Instead, he imagined what would happen after those words. The questions, the numbers, the disappointment, the look on her face when she realized how long he'd kept it from her, and then something worse. He imagined her telling him they would handle it together, because if she did that, he would have to admit that he had spent weeks making decisions she should have been making with him. He couldn't face that, so he told himself he was protecting her. That was easier. That night, Claire fell asleep beside him. Matthew stayed awake. He looked at the ceiling and built the argument again. If he left, Claire wouldn't have to carry his failure. If they separated their finances, she could protect her future. If he sold what needed to be sold, he could absorb the consequences himself. He kept returning to the same thought. She shouldn't have to pay for something she didn't do. That part was true. But there was another truth Matthew kept pushing away. If he told Claire everything, she would get to choose. She might stay. She might forgive him. She might decide they could survive it. Or she might look at everything he'd done and decide she couldn't. Matthew didn't know which possibility frightened him more, because as long as he made the decision himself, he didn't have to find out. He could call it sacrifice. He could call it protection. He could tell himself he was giving Claire a chance at a better life. But underneath all of that was a man who couldn't bear to sit across from the woman he loved and wait for her to decide whether he was still worth choosing. Matthew turned toward her. Claire was asleep, one hand resting near his side of the bed. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he gently moved it back toward her. The next morning, he called the attorney. This time, he wasn't asking what divorce might look like. He was asking how to begin. Claire stopped asking Matthew if everything was okay, not because she believed him, because she had started noticing what happened whenever she asked. He paused. He chose his words. Then he gave her just enough to end the conversation, so she stopped pushing. For several days, she let him move through the house with his phone calls, his briefcase, and his locked office drawer. She didn't follow him. She didn't search through his things. She simply started paying closer attention to the parts of their life that belonged to both of them. One evening, Matthew left his laptop open on the kitchen counter while he went upstairs. Claire walked past it without looking. Then, a notification appeared. She stopped. It was a bank transfer. She recognized the account immediately. Their joint savings. Claire stared at the amount. It wasn't enough to frighten her by itself. What bothered her was the date. She opened the banking app on her phone. The transfer was there. So was another one from the previous week. Claire sat down. She went back through the statements. There were several payments she didn't recognize. None of them were enormous. That almost made them harder to understand. They looked like pieces of something. A payment here, a transfer there. Money moved from one place to another. She wrote down the dates. Then she noticed something. Most of them began around the same time Matthew started coming home late. Claire put the phone down. She didn't call him. She didn't accuse him. She waited. When Matthew came home that evening, he kissed her cheek. Hey, how was your day? Fine. He looked at her. Actually, Claire smiled faintly. Actually, he set his keys down. I'm exhausted. I can tell. He smiled. Dinner? It's in the oven. You're the best. Claire looked at him. For a second, she almost told him about the transfers. Instead, she said, Go change. Matthew disappeared upstairs. Claire stayed in the kitchen. She opened the banking app again. This time, she followed one of the payments. It led to a company name she didn't recognize. She searched the name. A financial services firm appeared. Claire stared at the screen. Financial planning. Asset protection. She sat back. That wasn't proof of anything. Matthew could have had a reason. There was always a reason. But she had spent too many years with him to ignore the feeling that these things were connected. The next evening, she looked through the shared account again. She found another payment. This one was tied to the redevelopment project. Claire knew the project. She knew Matthew had been under pressure. She also knew enough about his work to understand that something had gone wrong. The pieces didn't fit yet. So she kept looking. Not obsessively, carefully. She found a corrective work invoice, then an email about revised engineering documents, then a payment associated with the project. Claire sat at the kitchen table with the papers spread in front of her. The realization came slowly. Matthew hadn't been hiding another woman. He had been hiding a professional mistake, a serious one. But Claire read through the documents again. The mistake wasn't the catastrophe Matthew seemed to believe it was. There were financial consequences. There were questions that needed answering. There was work that needed correcting. But there were also insurance procedures, company responsibility, contractor involvement, ways forward. Claire leaned back. She felt something inside her settle. Then something else took its place. He had been terrified, and instead of coming home and telling her, he'd been trying to solve it alone. She looked toward the hallway. Matthew was upstairs. Claire thought about all the times they had sat at that kitchen table together. They had handled money problems, family problems, work problems, bad news, embarrassing news. They had never promised each other that nothing would go wrong. They had promised to talk when it did. Claire swallowed. The financial problem didn't frighten her nearly as much as the fact that Matthew had decided she didn't need to know. Then she found the attorney's name. She had seen it before, on the envelope, in his briefcase. She searched the name on the document. Her heart began beating faster. Claire didn't read everything at once. She read one page, then another. The language was formal, cold. Their house was listed. Their accounts were listed. Their retirement funds, insurance, assets. She stopped. This wasn't simply financial planning. Matthew was preparing for separation. Claire lowered the papers. For several seconds she couldn't move. She wasn't thinking about another woman anymore. She wasn't even thinking about the money. She was thinking about the man upstairs. The man who had once sat in his car afraid to tell her he'd made a mistake. The man she'd told, more than once, that she would rather know the truth than be protected from it. And now, he had spent weeks preparing to end their marriage without asking what she wanted. Claire's eyes filled with tears. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. She could wake him. She could put the documents on the bed. She could demand an explanation. Instead, she carefully returned everything to where she'd found it. She didn't want to catch him. She wanted to hear him. The next morning, Matthew came into the kitchen. "Morning. Morning." He reached for his coffee. Claire watched him. He looked tired. For a moment, she almost said, "I know," but she didn't. She wanted to give him one last chance to choose the truth himself. That evening, she waited until they were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. Matthew looked up from his phone. "What?" Claire folded her hands. "Is there something happening that could change our marriage?" Matthew went completely still. Claire watched his face. She had already found the answer. Now she needed to know whether he would give it to her. Matthew didn't move. Claire kept her hands folded on the table. "Is there something happening that could change our marriage?" For a few seconds, he looked at her as if he hadn't understood the question. Then his eyes dropped. "No." Claire watched him. Just one word, nothing else. "No?" Matthew shook his head. "No. Nothing that's going to change our marriage." Claire's fingers tightened against each other beneath the table. She could have put the documents in front of him. She could have asked about the transfers, the attorney, the apartment, the project. Instead, she looked at him for another moment. "Okay." Matthew exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Claire noticed. That small release told her more than his answer. "What made you ask that?" He said. She almost smiled. "Just wondering." "About what?" "Nothing." Matthew studied her. "You've been acting different." "So have you." He looked away. Claire waited. Neither spoke. The refrigerator hummed behind them. A car passed outside. Matthew finally reached for his phone. "I've had a lot going on." Claire nodded. "I know." He looked back at her. "You do?" "Yeah. It's just work." She looked at him. "Okay." Again, that word. Matthew seemed relieved by it. Claire wasn't. She stood and began collecting the plates from the table. "I'll do those," Matthew said. "You don't have to." "I don't mind." She handed him one. Their fingers touched. A few minutes later, they were standing at the sink together. It was almost painfully ordinary. Matthew rinsed a plate. Claire dried it. For years, they had done this without thinking. Tonight, Claire noticed how carefully she was avoiding looking at him. Matthew glanced over. "You okay?" She nodded. "I'm fine." He almost smiled. "That's what you always say." Claire looked at him. "Maybe you should have listened to yourself when you said that." Matthew's hands stopped under the water. "What does that mean?" "Nothing." He waited. She kept drying the plate. "You sure?" Claire nodded. "I'm sure." Matthew turned back to the sink. Neither said anything else. Later that night, Claire sat alone in the bedroom. She opened the drawer beside her bed. Inside was the old photograph from their wedding. She picked it up. Matthew was smiling in the picture. She was laughing. Neither of them looked worried about the future. Claire put the photograph back. She wasn't ready to decide what she would do. She didn't know whether she wanted to stay. She didn't know whether Matthew would actually go through with what he'd been preparing, but she knew she was done trying to pull the truth out of him. If he wanted to tell her, he would. If he wanted to leave, he would. She wasn't going to keep standing in the doorway of a conversation he refused to have. The next morning, Matthew left for work. He kissed her cheek. "Love you." Claire looked at him. "Love you too." He smiled and walked out. Claire stood by the door until she heard his car leave. Then she went back to the kitchen. She opened the drawer where she'd hidden the financial documents. She took them out. This time, she didn't put them back. She placed them in a folder and set it on the table. The house was quiet. Claire rested one hand on top of the folder. She stayed there for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and walked away. The folder remained on the table. Matthew almost changed his mind 3 times before Claire came home. The cake was already on the counter. Chocolate with vanilla frosting, the kind Claire usually picked when she didn't feel like pretending she wanted something healthier. Beside it sat a birthday card. He had written only 3 lines. "Happy birthday. I hope this year is good to you. Love, Matthew." He had stared at the last line for several minutes before leaving it there. Claire walked through the front door around 6. She stopped when she saw the cake. "Oh." Matthew looked up. "Happy birthday." She smiled. "Thank you." She put her purse down. "You bought a cake?" "Yeah." "You don't bake." "I know." A small laugh escaped her. For a few minutes, they almost looked like themselves. Claire took off her coat. Matthew poured her something to drink. She asked about his day. He said it was fine. She watched him over the rim of her glass. "You okay?" "Yeah." "You've been saying that a lot." Matthew looked down. "I know." Claire didn't push. They sat across from each other. The cake remained untouched. Matthew kept glancing toward the folder beside his chair. Claire noticed. She had been expecting this moment. Still, seeing the folder made something inside her tighten. Matthew finally reached down. He placed it on the table. Claire looked at it, then at him. "What's that?" "I need to talk to you." She nodded. "Okay." Matthew opened the folder. The papers were perfectly arranged. Claire looked at the first page. She already knew what it was. Matthew watched her face. He had imagined this moment countless times. In every version, Claire cried. Sometimes she yelled. Sometimes she asked what she had done wrong. Sometimes she walked out. Instead, she simply looked at the papers. Then she looked at him. "Are you completely sure?" Matthew swallowed. "Yes." Claire held his gaze. "Okay." His shoulders dropped slightly. "Claire, no." She touched the edge of the papers. "You don't have to explain right now." "I want to." "Do you?" Matthew stopped. The question landed harder than he expected. Claire looked down again. Matthew rubbed his palms against his jeans. I've thought about this for a long time. I know. His eyes lifted. You know? She didn't answer. Instead, Claire reached for her birthday bag. Matthew watched her unzip it. For a second, he thought she was looking for tissues. She pulled out a sealed envelope. Then she placed it on the table. Matthew stared at it. What is that? Open it. He didn't move. Claire, open it. There was no anger in her voice. That somehow made him more nervous. Matthew picked up the envelope. It was heavier than he expected. He tore it open. The first page slid out. He recognized the account number. His face changed. He looked at Claire. She said nothing. He pulled out another page. The project documentation, then another. A financial advisor. Matthew's fingers tightened around the papers. He already knew what was coming. Still, he wasn't prepared for it. He pulled out the final document. The attorney's name was at the top. Matthew stopped breathing for a second. He looked at Claire. She was watching him, not triumphantly, not angrily, just quietly. Matthew looked back at the papers. His own transfers, his professional mistake, the financial planning, the legal preparation, things he had convinced himself were hidden, things he had spent weeks arranging in private. They were all sitting on the birthday table in front of his wife. He lowered the documents. How long have you known? Claire looked at him. Long enough. Matthew swallowed. Why didn't you say anything? Claire's eyes moved toward the cake. Would you have listened? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She looked back at him. You kept telling me everything was fine. Matthew stared at the table. I was trying to fix it. I know. I didn't want you involved. I know. I thought... Claire lifted a hand. Matthew. He stopped. She wasn't asking him to defend himself. She wasn't even asking him to explain. She reached toward the divorce papers, then stopped before touching them. I wasn't angry because you made a mistake. Matthew looked at her. I was angry because you decided what I was allowed to know. He said nothing. Claire's voice stayed quiet. You decided what I could handle. Matthew looked down. I was trying to protect you. I know. That answer seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. Claire looked at him. I would have been scared. Matthew's eyes lifted. I would have been angry. She paused. I might have needed time. Matthew nodded slowly. But I would have had the right to decide what I wanted to do. The room went quiet. Claire glanced at the cake. The candles were still in the box. The card was still unopened. Matthew looked at the divorce papers, then at the envelope. For the first time, the decision he had spent weeks calling protection looked different. He hadn't protected Claire from the consequences. He had protected himself from having to let Claire decide whether she was willing to face those consequences with him. His eyes lowered. Claire didn't reach for his hand. She didn't pull the papers toward herself. She simply sat across from him. And for the first time that night, Matthew understood that the question wasn't whether Claire could survive what had happened. It was whether he had ever given her the chance to choose. Matthew kept looking at the documents. He picked up the bank statement again. You found these? Claire nodded. How? I looked at our accounts. You went through my things? No. She shook her head. I went through things that belonged to both of us. Matthew lowered his eyes. He set the statement back on the table. I was going to tell you. When? He didn't answer. Claire waited. When you had fixed everything. Matthew nodded slightly. I thought that would be better. For who? He looked at her. For you. Claire let out a quiet breath. You keep saying that. Because I meant it. I know. She looked down at the papers. That doesn't make it okay. Matthew swallowed. I made a mistake, Claire. I know. I didn't know how bad it was going to get. I know. I was scared. That was the first time he'd said it without trying to hide behind another explanation. Claire looked at him. Matthew's voice dropped. I didn't want you losing money because of something I did. Claire nodded slowly. That part I understand. He looked relieved for half a second. Then she continued, "What I don't understand is why you decided I would rather lose my husband than face a financial problem." Matthew looked away. "I wasn't trying to." "You were." He stopped. Claire rubbed her thumb against the edge of the envelope. "You decided what I could handle. I thought I was giving you a way out. You were giving yourself an answer." Matthew looked at her. "What does that mean?" "You were afraid I'd leave if I knew." He didn't respond. Claire waited. "And instead of letting me decide, you decided for me." Matthew's jaw tightened. "That wasn't why." "Then why?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came. Claire nodded once. "That's what I thought." She gathered the documents into a stack. "I could have handled the money." Matthew shook his head. "You don't know what it could have cost." "No." She looked at him. "I don't." Her voice became quieter. "But I would have found out." Matthew stared at her. "I would have been scared. I would have been angry. I probably would have blamed you for a while." He gave a small nod. But Claire stopped. She looked down at her hands. "I would have sat right here with you." Matthew's eyes filled. She continued before she lost the words. "We would have figured out what to do." The room went quiet. "I wasn't asking you to be perfect." Matthew looked at her. "I was asking you to let me be your wife." That landed harder than anything she'd said before. Matthew looked down. For weeks, he'd thought being a good husband meant taking the problem away before it reached her. Now he was beginning to understand what Claire had actually wanted. Not protection from the problem, a place beside him while they faced it. Claire touched the divorce papers. "This isn't about whether you made a mistake." Matthew said nothing. "It isn't even about being scared." She looked at him. "It's about you making a decision that belonged to both of us." Matthew's eyes lowered. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "I believe you." He looked up. Claire's expression softened. "I believe you thought you were protecting me." Matthew swallowed. "But you don't think I was?" "No." She shook her head. "I think you were protecting yourself from having to hear what I might choose." Matthew didn't argue. He couldn't. The cake sat untouched on the counter. The birthday card was still unopened. Claire looked toward it. Then, back at him. "I need some space." Matthew nodded. "Okay." She reached for the envelope, then stopped. "You can keep those." He looked at the documents. "I don't want them." "I know." She left the envelope on the table. At the doorway, Claire turned. "Matthew?" "Yeah?" "Don't make another decision for me." He looked at her. She waited a second, then walked upstairs. Matthew remained at the table. The divorce papers were still in front of him. So were the documents he'd spent weeks believing Claire should never have to see. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about how to control what happened next. He was thinking about what Claire might choose when he finally stopped choosing for her. Matthew left the house 2 days later. There wasn't much to say. He packed a suitcase, then stood in the bedroom doorway looking around as if he'd forgotten something. Claire was folding clothes on the other side of the room. "You need anything else?" "No." "You've got your work stuff?" "Yeah." She nodded. Matthew zipped the suitcase. "I'll make sure the mortgage is covered." "Okay. And I'll send you everything from the project." Claire looked at him. "Everything?" "Everything." She nodded. "Good." Matthew picked up the suitcase. At the front door, he stopped. He looked back at the house, the kitchen table, the hallway, the room where Claire had once waited up for him after difficult days. He had spent weeks telling himself that leaving was an act of love. Standing there with a suitcase in his hand, it didn't feel noble. It just felt like leaving. Claire stood several feet away. Matthew wanted to say something that would make the moment easier. Nothing came. "Take care of yourself." "You too." He walked out. Claire closed the door. For the first time in 9 years, Matthew drove away without knowing when or whether he would come back. The first week alone was quieter than he expected. There was no second coffee cup beside the sink, no one asking whether he'd eaten, no Claire reminding him that he was thinking himself into a hole. He almost called her several times. He didn't. Instead, He went back to the problem he'd been avoiding. At work, Matthew met with his manager and the project team. This time, he didn't soften the story. When they asked what had happened, he explained exactly where he'd missed the updated information. "I should have caught it." His manager nodded. "We'll deal with the rest." Matthew accepted that. No excuses, no shifting blame, just the part that belonged to him. He also stopped making private financial moves. He gave the advisor complete information. He documented every transfer. He sent Claire copies of the accounts, the project documents, and the insurance correspondence. The first email was short. "Here are the complete documents. I want you to have everything." He almost added more. He didn't. A few days later, Claire made a decision of her own. She moved part of the money she had independently earned into an account in her own name. She didn't ask Matthew. She didn't need permission. For years, they had made financial decisions together. Now she needed to know that she could make one without being afraid of what Matthew might decide for her. She wasn't trying to punish him. She simply needed something in her life that belonged to her choice. Matthew saw the transfer when he reviewed the joint statements. His first reaction was a flash of fear. Then he stopped. Claire hadn't done anything wrong. He had no right to ask her to reverse it. He stared at the screen. A month earlier, he would have called her immediately. He would have asked what she was doing. He might even have convinced himself that he was protecting their finances. Instead, he closed the account. That night, Matthew sat alone in his apartment with his phone beside him. He understood something he hadn't understood before. Claire wasn't rejecting him. She was making decisions he had once made on her behalf. And if he really meant what he'd said about wanting her to be free, he had to respect that freedom, even when it frightened him. Weeks passed. One Saturday morning, Claire called. Matthew almost didn't answer. "Hello? It's me." "I know." There was a pause. "I got the documents." "Okay." "I went through them." Matthew sat down. "Is anything missing?" "No." He nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Good." Another silence. Then Claire said, "The insurance company approved part of the claim." Matthew closed his eyes. "That's good." "Yeah." He waited. She didn't say anything else. Finally, Matthew said, "Thank you for telling me. I thought you should know." The call ended a minute later. Matthew put the phone down. It wasn't reconciliation. It wasn't even close. But Claire had called because she had information and believed he deserved to have it. She had included him, not because she had to, because she chose to. That mattered. Matthew opened his laptop. He typed an email. "Claire." He stopped, deleted it, started again. "Here are the updated documents from the project and the insurance company. I want you to have the complete information. You don't need to respond." He read it once, then sent it. No explanation, no request, no pressure, just the truth. For months, Matthew had believed love meant taking the hardest decision away from Claire. Now he was learning something harder. Sometimes loving someone meant giving the decision back and respecting what they chose to do with it. Claire didn't miss Matthew every day. Some mornings, she woke up and felt lighter. Other mornings, she reached for her phone before remembering there was no reason to check whether he'd made it home from work. She was getting used to the space between them. Not comfortable with it, just used to it. Months passed that way. At first, most of their conversations were practical. The house, the insurance claim, documents, bills. Then, little by little, other things slipped in. A book Claire had started, something funny that happened at work, a restaurant they'd both forgotten about, nothing important, which was probably why it mattered. Matthew had changed in ways Claire could see. When she was quiet, he didn't immediately ask what was wrong. When she was upset, he didn't tell her she was misunderstanding him. When she needed time, he gave it to her. One evening, they were talking about the insurance claim when Claire mentioned she'd been overwhelmed. Matthew went quiet. She waited. He didn't offer advice. He didn't tell her what she should do. Finally, Claire said, "You're not going to fix it?" "No." A small laugh escaped her. "You almost did." "I know." She smiled. "You're learning." "Trying to." They moved on. After they hung up, Claire sat at the edge of her bed. She thought about how often she'd done the same thing in their marriage. Matthew would ask if she was okay. She'd say yes. He'd ask again. She'd say, "I'm fine." Sometimes she was. Sometimes she wasn't. She had always been proud of handling things herself. But there were moments when independence had been easier than saying, "I need help." Claire didn't like that realization. It was easier to believe everything that went wrong between them belonged entirely to Matthew. But the truth was more complicated. His secrecy was his responsibility. The decision to prepare for divorce without telling her was his. She wasn't going to carry that for him. Still, she could admit that she'd spent years hiding parts of herself too. She hid exhaustion. She hid fear. She hid the moments when she wanted Matthew to simply sit beside her instead of assuming she could handle everything. They had both been afraid of vulnerability. They had just expressed it differently. One Saturday afternoon, Claire called him. Matthew answered. "Hey." "Hi. You okay?" Claire smiled. "You almost asked." "What?" "If I'm okay." "I was going to." "I know." She sat at the kitchen table. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When everything was happening, why didn't you tell me you were scared?" Matthew was quiet. "I didn't know how." Claire looked down. "That sounds familiar. What do you mean?" She hesitated. "I've spent a lot of years acting like needing somebody meant I wasn't handling things." Matthew was quiet. Then he said, "You never seemed weak to me." Claire smiled faintly. "Sometimes I made it hard to know what I needed. I probably made it hard to tell me." "Yeah." Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. For once, the silence didn't feel like punishment. Claire looked around the kitchen. There was still an empty chair across from her. She had spent months thinking about the birthday, the envelope, the papers, Matthew's face when he realized she already knew. Some days, remembering it still made her angry. Other days, she missed him so badly that she hated herself for it. She had once believed forgiveness meant reaching a point where the past stopped hurting. She was beginning to understand that it didn't work that way. She could understand why Matthew had been afraid without approving what he had done. She could miss him without being ready to take him back. She could believe he was changing without pretending the damage had disappeared. That distinction mattered. A few weeks later, Matthew sent her a message. "Want to get coffee sometime?" Claire stared at it. She almost put the phone down. Then she noticed what wasn't in the message. No request to come home. No question about whether she forgave him. No promise that he'd changed. Just coffee. Claire looked at the screen for another few seconds. Then she typed, "Okay." She sent it before she could change her mind. And for the first time since the birthday, the next decision in their story belonged entirely to Claire. Claire almost canceled. She had changed her mind twice before leaving the house. It wasn't that she didn't want to see Matthew. That was the problem. She did. She just didn't know what seeing him meant. They hadn't called it a date. Matthew had been careful about that. When Claire arrived at the small restaurant, he was already there. He stood when he saw her. "Hi." "Hi." Neither hugged. Matthew pulled out the chair. Claire sat. "Thank you." He nodded and sat across from her. For a few seconds, they looked at the menus without reading them. Claire finally smiled. "This is awkward." Matthew laughed quietly. "Yeah. Good." "Good?" "I was worried I'd be the only one." He smiled. "You're not." The waiter came by. They ordered. Then they sat there again. Claire looked at him. So, you invited me." "I did." "Why?" Matthew took a breath. "I wanted to see you." She waited. And I thought coffee might be easier." Claire glanced around. "This isn't coffee." "I know. Good planning." He laughed. It was the first time they'd laughed together in a long time. The conversation slowly became easier. They talked about work. Claire complained about a meeting that had run 20 minutes over because nobody wanted to make a decision. Matthew told her about a coworker who kept sending emails with the subject line, "Quick question," and then writing 6 paragraphs. Claire laughed. "That's not a quick question." "I know. People are ridiculous." They are. For a little while, they sounded like themselves again. Then the food arrived. The laughter faded naturally. Claire looked down at her plate. Are you okay? Matthew almost answered automatically. Then he stopped. I'm trying not to answer that too quickly. Claire smiled. Fair. They ate. After a few minutes, Claire asked, Why haven't you asked me to come home? Matthew looked at her. I thought about it. She waited. A lot. But you didn't. No. Why? Matthew set his fork down. Because I don't want to make another decision for you. Claire looked at him. He didn't look away. I did that once, he said. I'm not doing it again. She nodded slowly. That answer stayed with her. After dinner, they walked outside. They stood beside their cars. Claire looked at him. This doesn't mean we're getting back together. I know. I don't even know if that's what I want. I know. She studied him. You're really not going to argue with me? Matthew smiled. No. That's new. I'm working on it. She laughed. Okay. He looked at her. Do you want to do this again sometime? Claire hesitated. I don't know. Matthew nodded. That's okay. She studied him for another second. Maybe. His smile was small. Maybe works. That became their rhythm. A coffee here, a walk there, dinner when neither of them had somewhere else to be. They didn't talk about getting back together. They talked. Sometimes Claire laughed. Sometimes she got quiet. Once, she left dinner early because a question about their finances brought the birthday back too sharply. Matthew didn't follow her. He didn't call that night. The next morning, he sent one message. I understand. Take whatever time you need. She read it twice. A few weeks later, Claire suggested they return to the small restaurant where they'd gone after their first disastrous dinner. Matthew smiled when she said the name. Still better than the first place? Much better. You were very confident about that. I was right. You were. She laughed. They sat at the same table near the window. Claire looked around. I can't believe we came here after that terrible meal. You said the food was overpriced. It was. You didn't have to say it 3 times. I wanted to make sure you understood. Matthew laughed. You've always been good at that. At what? Making sure I understand. She smiled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Matthew looked down at his hands. I remember why I liked you. Claire raised an eyebrow. Only liked? He smiled. You told me the truth. Her expression softened. I thought you liked that. I did. He paused. Somewhere along the way, I became the person who couldn't handle hearing it. Claire didn't rush to comfort him. She didn't tell him it was okay. She simply reached across the table. Her hand stopped a few inches from his, not touching, just there. Matthew looked at it, then at her. He didn't move his hand toward hers. Claire didn't either. For a while, they sat that way, talking about nothing particularly important. And for once, neither of them needed to decide what came next. Claire didn't tell Matthew she was ready to come home. Not that night, not the next week. They kept seeing each other. Sometimes it was dinner, sometimes coffee. Sometimes they sat in his car and talked until neither of them had anything left to say. There were good days. There were also days when Claire became angry all over again. One evening, Matthew mentioned a financial decision he'd made at work. Claire went quiet. He noticed. You don't like what I decided? I don't know. Matthew waited. A year earlier, he would have explained why he was right. This time he said, Okay. Claire looked at him. That's it? What do you want me to say? She shook her head. I don't know. Then we don't have to figure it out tonight. She looked out the window. A few seconds passed. That's new. Matthew smiled. I'm working on it. She smiled too. The changes were small. That was what made Claire trust them. Matthew didn't promise he would never make another mistake. He stopped hiding the ones he made. When something affected their finances, he told her. When work became difficult, he told her. When he was scared, he said so. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes after sitting with the words too long, but he said them. Claire changed, too. She stopped saying "I'm fine" when she wasn't. She began asking for help before she was exhausted. Once, she called Matthew after a difficult day. "I don't need you to fix this. Okay? I just need somebody to listen." "I can do that." And he did. Their marriage wasn't magically repaired. They were still careful with each other. There were subjects they approached slowly. Some memories could still change the temperature of a conversation. The birthday was one of them, but they weren't avoiding it anymore. Months after their first dinner together again, Claire asked Matthew to meet her at the small restaurant where they'd first really connected. When he arrived, she was already sitting at their old table. He smiled. "You picked this place." "I did." "Why?" Claire looked around. "I wanted to remember something." "What?" "That we weren't always this complicated." Matthew laughed softly. "We were probably always complicated." "Probably." The waiter came by. They ordered. For a while, they talked about ordinary things. Then Claire looked at him. "I've been thinking." Matthew waited. "I don't want to pretend none of this happened." "I don't either. I don't want the old marriage back." Matthew's expression changed slightly. "I understand." Claire looked down at the table. "I don't think we were as honest with each other as we thought." Matthew nodded. "No, but I don't think we have to stay that way." He didn't answer. Claire finally looked at him. "I want to try again." Matthew stared at her. "You're sure?" Claire gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "No." He smiled despite himself. She shook her head. "I mean, I'm sure I want to try. I just don't know exactly what that looks like." Matthew nodded. "Okay. And if it doesn't work, then we'll deal with that." Claire studied him. "You're really going to let me say that?" "Yes." A small smile appeared on her face. "Okay." They didn't move in together that night. They didn't announce anything. They simply agreed to keep rebuilding. Slowly. Honestly. When something hurt, they talked about it. When one of them needed space, the other respected it. When they disagreed, neither treated disagreement like abandonment. The marriage they rebuilt wasn't the one they had before. It had fewer assumptions, more conversations, more room for either person to say, "I don't know." On Claire's next birthday, Matthew handed her a small card. No elaborate dinner, no surprise, just the two of them at home. Claire opened it. Inside, he had written, "Whatever happens next, I want it to be your choice too." She read it once, then again. She looked up at him. "You finally learned." Matthew smiled. "I'm trying." Claire nodded. She folded the card and placed it beside her plate. Then she reached across the table and took his hand. This time, she didn't stop a few inches away. Matthew looked at their hands. Claire squeezed his fingers once. Neither of them said anything. The cake sat between them. The candles were still in the box. But Claire was smiling. And Matthew, for once, didn't try to guess what would happen next. "Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you were Claire, after everything Matthew had done, would you have given him another chance, or would you have walked away for good? Tell me honestly in the comments. I'd really love to hear how you would have handled it. And if this story reminded you that love isn't just about staying together, but about trust, honesty, and giving each other the freedom to choose, make sure you subscribe to Greer Stories and join our family. There are more stories coming. Stories about love, mistakes, second chances, and the choices that can change a life. Until the next story, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and remember, sometimes the hardest part of loving someone is giving them the freedom to choose.